It is by hi.
Mama Chede, good morning.
Morning, Daddy. I'm happy to see you after such a long time.
Yeah,
Eh,
yeah, but as I said that I might not stay longer
mm,
as I'm rushing to the Eastern Cape. Yeah.
okay. I think it's 9 o'clock. Kim, can you take your position as the program director? Thank you. Miss Ngobeni, are you in? Can you hear us? Okay. You can start the
Good
meeting.
morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. Welcome to day 4 of our Heritage Seminar. My name is Kim Ngobeni, and I will be your program director for the day. Today, we are the Heritage Protection Unit, and we have a very interesting lineup. We have people who have been in the heritage sector for a very long time and touching a very interesting topic. So our topic is the missing link in inclusive heritage resources management. So having said that, we would like to play the inset of our CEO, Advocate Lungisa Mohas.
Good day, my name is Lungisa Malgas. I'm the CEO of the South African Heritage Resources Agency. Thank you all for joining us today as we celebrate the unique and diverse heritage of the country we call home. We are honored and humbled to have you as our guests. We are further honored to take this opportunity to share and celebrate the many areas of our cultural heritage resources with our community as we celebrate Heritage Month 2022. We are extremely diverse society with many layers in our heritage landscape, and we acknowledge that the greatest part about our heritage is this diversity. We are a nation of 11 official languages that also celebrates other languages commonly used by our international friends and visitors. We are also a nation that celebrates the indigenous languages of the First Nations that originated in our beautiful land. We come from a painful past which will forever be tainted by the legacy of apartheid and colonialism, which is why our heritage is so extremely important to us. Our heritage is a source of identity and cohesion for our nation. It makes us who we are. It shapes and molds us and gives us a sense of belonging. It is a story for all our children to share, irrespective of their differences. It is passed down from generation to generation, linking the present to the past. Our heritage finds expression in our rituals, food, music, art, and our significant sites and objects. This is what makes South Africa a magnificent space. We are home to the most beautiful sites, objects, dating back prehistorical times, which opens a window into lives of the earliest ancestors of our humankind. Our indigenous knowledge systems, which have been preserved by our elders and traditional healers, are also a vital part of our heritage. This year's Heritage Month webinar series is taking place in the shadow of COVID-19, which has taken massive toll on human life, on our communities, and on our economy. As the world recovers from the battle against COVID-19, we are encouraged by the united global effort to beat the virus. It shows that through collaboration and cooperation, we can achieve and overcome anything on this planet, which is why we are taking this year's Heritage Month webinar as an opportunity for us to collaborate and build a global network of partners that will assist us in developing a world-class heritage sector in South Africa. I thank you.
Thank you so much to our CEO in her absentia. She's very supportive in all that we have been doing, and I would like to thank her for all the support that she gives us through all our engagements. Thank you so much, CEO, in her absentia. All right, for now we are moving to the introduction, and this will be done by the Heritage Protection Unit Manager, Ms. Nkosazana Machete, with over 15 years in the heritage sector and over 20 years as an inspector. So she will introduce the topic and what inspired this topic, and yes, we look forward to her introduction. Ms. Nkosazana Machete, please feel free to join in.
Thank you, Program Director. Let me say hello to our guests, our colleagues, and to our presenters. The National Heritage Resources Act, number 25 of 1999, defines living heritage as an intangible aspect of inherited culture, which may include tradition, cultural tradition, oral history, rituals, performances, skill, technology, and indigenous knowledge system. It also includes the holistic processes. The story behind a site is far greater significant than the fabric of the site itself. And in many cases, there is no physical evidence of an important event, memorialization, such as installation of a commemorative artwork. It may take place to mark and to remember and also what has happened on the site. This has caused the identification of heritage resources, both tangible and intangible, as a complex subject. It needs to illustrate the importance of including in heritage tangible issues in the heritage component of planning and development. There is a missing link, as the topic is saying, where heritage, intangible aspects of heritage are included and merged with what is happening on the site, primarily because of the intangible aspects of it that are not touchable or seen by people, as the rituals that I've been talking about. We need to recognize the value of diversity, and that requires the inclusion of culture in all developmental processes. That will be in line with the international standards with regard to development without culture as development without a soul. We must remember that there is a relationship between environment and culture, which remains the pro-vital role that it plays in a certain site. Irrespective of the obvious generalization and assumption that ties between the environment and the cultural heritage resources, the management of these two preserved fields has developed separately as two multi-phased and physical disciplines, and each with its own legal framework and policies and aspects that are enforcing these legal frameworks and policies. We need to demonstrate that the primary legislations of heritage and environment needs to be treated both as an integral part of the environment or the sites that we are dealing with. There is a link between NARA and NEMA, and we need to acknowledge the obvious interconnectedness between the environment and culture. In reference to National Heritage Resources Act, to the environment, also the NEMA Act, both they show spatial contact and a subject consisting of physical things, which is a common occurrence in the field that we're working with. We need to investigate the need for the designation of heritage areas to be protected, and any kind of heritage, and also any place where there is cultural and environmental interest. There is a role that needs to be played here. Local municipalities, provincial heritage resources authorities, where they must develop a social, economic, and social environment and economic sustainability on the sites, and also to show the elements of the environment and culture and cultural elements that are linked and interrelated. Therefore, that the effects of the decisions on aspects of environment and the people in environment, including heritage, must be taken into account. There must be equitable access to environmental resources and heritage resources, and then there must also be intergovernmental coordination and harmony of cultural, environmental policies, and all the legal and frameworks that we have, that we are mandated by our different acts to enforce whatever that is happening on the site, primarily protection of intangible cultural heritage. Thank you, Program Director. I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Ms. Machete, for that powerful introduction. I think it's a very necessary topic, the missing link between tangible and the intangible heritage. Also, how do we connect with the NARA and the NEMA? I think that's very, very profound. Without wasting any time, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is a social justice activist that serves as World Heritage Specialist at the National Heritage Council. Is the founder and director of Xenia Consulting, is the co-editor of Robben Island Rainbow Dreams, the co-founder of South Africa's Liberation Heritage Route Project. His other heritage roles include being the first CEO of the Nelson Mandela Museum, the first educational head for Robben Island Museum. He also serves on the ministerial advisory committees for Memory of the World and for Repatriation and Restitution. He has also contributed to and co-curated diverse exhibitions and conservations on heritage transformation and contested heritage. He's also trained in business management, library sciences, archives, and heritage management. This next speaker is none other than Mr. Kwezi Mpumlwana, who will be dealing with the necessity of intangible or living heritage in heritage resources management. Thank you, Ntate Kwezi.
Good morning. I hope you have seen me because I'm going to go onto voice mode shortly. Program Director, CEO and colleagues, fellow panelists, thank you very much for inviting us to participate in this very important conversation. And firstly, I want to really congratulate SAHRA for this wonderful series once again to mark Heritage Month in a special way that gets practitioners, thinkers, and communities and doers to reflect and improve, share wisdom, experiences, and hopes on how we could and should be doing heritage going forward. Now, coming to the topic of today, and with the beautiful foregrounding that our distinguished colleagues have put and the wonderful opening remarks of the CEO, I will again go back to the idea that the UNESCO 2003 Convention defined heritage as the practice, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith. Communities, groups, and in some cases, individuals recognized as part of their cultural heritage. You have the different domains that have been identified for examining intangible cultural heritage or living heritage, as we often call it. But you find on the other side, we've got, as much as we don't call them domains, the different ways in which we've identified tangible heritage, sometimes as objects, sometimes as cultural landscapes, sometimes as sites of historical or natural or other significance. I like to argue that it's not only a missing link, it's also a lost opportunity sometimes, that we don't harness the wealth that is carried by living heritage in how we manage tangible heritage, as it were. And it is no criticism to the conveners to say that if you look at how we've named our session, we say living heritage in the management of heritage resources, as if in the way that we sometimes say Americans and African Americans, Americans and Asian Americans. So I think part of going forward thinking and doing about heritage, we would probably be saying living in intangible heritage and tangible heritage. Artificial as that division it might be, or it might look, there's definite value in both. I think that it is from living heritage that we get a better sense of what does this community valorize? What does this community despise? Whichever community you're looking at, whether it's a virtual community or a linguistic community or a spiritual community or a geographic or other community. Also, because as you all know, colleagues, I think we move from the point of view that heritage is that which a generation, a community determines that this is worthy to be transmitted, to be preserved for transmission to other generations to come. And that is why I refer to the issue of what does this community valorize. But there's also heritage that's transmitted in spite of us despising it, in spite of us as the community or just generation of a given time, almost like rebuking it. It does get transmitted. And it is in the living heritage, the lived experiences, the different domains, in the oral traditions of people, in the performing arts, in the social practices, in the rituals, in the commemorations. And we will probably look at this from the point of view of resistance and liberation heritage, which is what I currently work on. But before I do that, I want to quickly pull an example, an overarching framework, I would like to think, in the World Heritage System, where a number of years ago, a global strategy for a credible, balanced, and representative world heritage was adopted. And that strategy emphasized that success will be based on 5 C's. And these 5 C's were credibility. And I think that, were credibility, conservation, capacity building, communication, and communities. I believe that our heritage will be credible if communities identify with it and the attributes that we claim for it resonate with the communities who are associated with that heritage. And community for me is not just rural. Sometimes it's urban, sometimes it's virtual, sometimes it's generational. And how will we know that it resonates? It's when we understand their lived heritage, their living heritage, and their intangible associations with that particular heritage, whether it's an object, whether it's a space. Conservation. Future generations will not have access to any heritage, however much we like, however much we've invested in, if it is not conserved. And recent lessons show that, or prove over and over and over again, that most heritage, whether urban or rural, is best conserved when the scientific methods that we have learned at school are combined appropriately with the knowledge that is embedded in various communities. You will look, for example, at the Mutabatsindi natural resource that is found in Vembe district, and see how the traditional leadership there and the community, and probably even the traditional leaders, healers, play a role in ensuring that it is not destroyed or finished. And I think if it was only the scientific and legal methods, we would no longer be having that forest to this day. Then the area of capacity building, again, if we forget, or if we don't have the dialogue of civilizations, as it were, if we don't have a way in which, because capacity building, I use it as different from training. It's not experts going to communities to say, how do you do this? Recently, we went with Mayor Machete and other colleagues to some of the rural areas. And we find that people thought if they add some cement bricks to their mud rondavels, it might look better. And actually, by a capacity building exercise that reminds them that, no, actually, your mud brick is going to remain stronger and better by using your normal way of ukutyabeka. I will find the English for that one day, rather than bringing in cement or stones that are different from this. Because capacity building is the bridge by which, or is one of the bridges or main bridges by which the wealth that resides in intangible cultural heritage can be brought into the management of the tangible heritage resources, as it were. And when that particular challenge that I've referred to was addressed, you started to see an improvement, or almost a back to the ideal situation for that particular heritage resource. Communication, definitely, all of these things have to be communicated, as it were. And I've been referring to communities, because none of this happens in space, as it were. But if we don't utilize the various domains that are expressed in the communities to then understand the significance that is attached to heritage. Recently, there is a cave that is under threat from a mine development. And the elders say, to some people, you just see stones that make up a mountain, but to us, we see wellness, we see transformation, we see access to those that are at rest. And this is what those elders are saying in that community. And so, again, I'll move quickly to the resistance and heritage, but in the same spirit of what I have mentioned above. There are sites which carry different meanings to different people. So there are sites which carry the story of victory of the Zulu people, for example, over the British Army. But to the British people, Isandlwana carries the story of their courage and strategic leadership. And you see this conveyed in the different ways in which, let's say, the Zulu orator recounts the successes of Isandlwana, or how British literature or signage even, and sometimes exhibitions, reinterpret what happened there. And so if we are going to achieve, let's say, social redress if we're going to achieve restoration and restitution, part of what we will have to do is to re-examine these narratives. If we are to decolonize, which is a big issue that is raised by the forest movements and by other people, we won't get it in the books that are published in London or Cape Town. We will get it probably, a lot of it, in some of the domains of intangible cultural heritage, as it were. If you look at a space like Robben Island, when we opened it as a museum, for the first 3 or 4 years, we did not have collections on display. And when we did, some of them were made through traditional craftsmanship by political prisoners in the time that they were there. And each of them told a story of resilience, of adaptation of the environment, of hope, because some were objects that are used in sporting inside a prison context. Some were objects that were used for educational, what you call, or for other forms of asserting dignity. The knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, whether you look at it as foods, whether you're looking at it as medicines, whether you're looking at it as how natural resources are used to build Indumba or other kinds of spaces, you see this kind of intangible, of the interaction of the tangible and the tangible. Where we need to succeed is to bring this in formally into the management of the heritage resources, as it were. If we call ourselves a diverse people that must unite, as our national coat of arms says, we must then accept that the plurality of voices, the plurality of epistemologies, according to the different communities, has to be harnessed into how we manage all the different kinds of resources that are in front of us. The digital era that is with us, the 4th and 5th industrial revolution, the time when there are serious cost containment measures, the time when there are serious reconfigurations of institutions, of ways of doing, and even the emphasis on alternative forms of memorialization. It brings us the opportunity to harness the wealth that is carried in the living heritage. But for that to happen well, we must develop it appropriately. Our opportunities are for our respective entities, as it were, to make their niche contribution to this beautiful tapestry of heritage, to this quilt that makes up our national and our global heritage. So even if you find a reconfigured future that has 3 or 4 entities in one, you would still have the people that do different work in a way that has synergy, in a way that helps future generations to have access to this heritage and other heritage that will emerge in the future. So we have a possibility to move into the space of innovation and renewal, to open fields that we have either not touched or we've not operated optimally. I'm thinking that South Africa itself as a whole has got a huge digital heritage. I don't mean digitized heritage, but the heritage of how we have been moving into the digital and computerized space from way back to recently. The way in which South Africa's commercial sector, the commercial heritage, people will tell you there was a time when you bought at the window, there was a time when you had 2 different kinds of rents. The dialogue of civilizations, which you see either in mission stations or other kinds of things, it's an example of a heritage that we have not explored optimally. And this interface of tangible and intangible offers us great wealth. You can say the same with the heritage of South African industry, or heritage of South Africa's seeds and food, or even South Africa's heritage about dispute resolution. There's a lot to write home about. So we sit in front of us with the opportunity to integrate sustainably the hardware, so the collections and the spaces and the buildings, the software, which is, I will call, in the minds and in the hearts of the people, and different heritage models that take these 2 worlds together. If we do this well, and we know that we're trying to achieve parity of esteem for natural, cultural, tangible, and intangible heritage, I think we will have moved a lot of steps forward to create the kind of South Africa that our forebears wanted, but also to help South Africa participate in the global system more meaningfully, more systematically, and more sustainably. So with those few words, I will want to stop and just say that the latest, and it might be a commercial if you like, latest nomination that South Africa is working on, the one that is called Nelson Mandela Legacy Sites, is based purely on intangible cultural heritage. We argue that these 10 sites are tangibly associated with ideas, literary works, and events that are the global significance in their time. And we go on to demonstrate that. And we've had to do quite interesting work in explaining the authenticity element to be able to make that link. And when those of you are familiar with the NARA document and the NARA plus 20 will sort of know how this connects. I thought I should mention that because I like to think that that nomination is one of the many possible practical ways of demonstrating the interface of these two heritages. Thank you very much, Program Director and participants. I stop there.
Thank you so much, Ntate Kwezi. I think you have said a mouthful, but very enlightening and eye-opening. And I loved how you summarized heritage resources management with the 5 C's, because indeed it's all about credibility, the authenticity of the site, and how we conserve the site. Also the capacity building, the communication, which leads to the public participations, and also how we involve those communities, because at the end of the day, whose heritage is it anyway? And I like how you made reference to the cave, because of when we talk about intangible heritage, we refer to the spiritualism, the spiritual side of things, the languages, the social aspects, you know, that are attached to that tangible heritage that we are conserving at such a time. So thank you for that enlightening presentation, and we thank you for your time and for always availing yourself. All right, thank you so much. Having said that, we're going to move to our next speaker. I think he needs no introduction, but he is one of the heritage and environmental management gurus. He is the former executive officer of the South African Heritage Resources Agency. He has worked in various government departments. He has lectured at Sol Plaatje. He has traveled the world preaching the gospel of cultural heritage conservation, and he is currently the chairperson of ICPRA. So having said that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Ntate Dumisani Sibai, who is also a living heritage. So he'll be speaking on intangible living heritage and heritage resources management. Thank you, Ntate.
Thank you, Kim, and good morning to colleagues. And to say that I'm also thrilled and happy to be part of this discussion. And I'm not going to delve into areas in which Mr. Mpumlwane or Professor Mpumlwane has already delved into. He's already made some proposals and also provided us with intellectual discourse on the whole issue of living heritage and living heritage and heritage resources management. And Kim, I think that you are making me feel that I am too important when I should not be, because I might be waffling in this discussion. Colleagues, mine is going to be looking at what transpired in the past. I think it's quite important. And maybe then the topic, Mama Cheta, should have been the missed opportunity instead of the link. Going back as far as 1998, colleagues, I think it's quite important that we begin to reflect. When there was transition and people knew that there's going to be changes in the National Monuments Act to a new animal which nobody at that time knew what it was going to be like. People who were associated with the management of the National Monuments Council began then a process, because they understood that we need to incorporate the intangible heritage. And that group of people was mostly academics, and it was led by Professor Kuse from then the University of Unitra, who was also part of the NMC Council. And it also had Professor Mapalala from KZN. It also had Professor Craig Sardine, who's now the head of the Human Science Research Council. It also had Professor Siraj Rasool, and it has Professor Leslie Vetz, and there was also had one of the Guru Zululi Kalinikos. These were people then who then appreciated the fact that the National Monuments Act does not cater for other heritage resources and also exclude living heritage. And then immediately established a committee within the National Monuments Council. And that committee was called Amasiko, because they realized that whatever act that is going to be established or promulgated must include Amasiko, which is loosely translated living heritage or intangible heritage. And quite a number of policy documents were then developed, and directions were also taken as to how then do we include this excluded part in our heritage conservation. But unfortunately, that initiative was not supported in the broader heritage landscape or broader heritage profession, for it was seen as a threat to some who understood heritage to mean the tangible. And from that stage, we then realized that we are going to hit challenges. We're going to have challenges, because part of the mainstream, all right, sector in conservation never understood or refused to appreciate that living heritage or intangible heritage and Amasiko is the integral part of conservation in some communities. Following that, the failure of that initiative to integrate living heritage Amasiko into the new legislation, there were other initiatives that were taken from outside the sector itself. Quite a number of researchers in various quarters started to write policy documents and also discussion papers on living heritage or Amasiko or intangible heritage. But again, all those documents never made it into the mainstream heritage resources conservation, or in some instances, they were then discarded or labeled as unscientific and could not be verifiable or are not within the scientific domain, which is understood in a Western notion of research. That was a missed opportunity. But again, you had younger people who joined the sector who insisted that indeed living heritage and Amasiko are very, very important. So when the NMC there was a transition from NMC to SAHRA, there was then realization that we need to integrate this concept, Amasiko, intangible heritage, into the functions of heritage resources management. Those of you who read and understand the significance of the past will also know that we then created a position when there was a transition from NMC to SAHRA. We had a new structure in the institution. We created a position in the heritage resources management of a living heritage officer. And the first officer who was employed was Mr. Peter Mukwena, the former CEO of SAHRA. He tried his best, but again, there was a resistance from ICOTA, the mainstream heritage conservation, And he was frustrated. He left institution. I'm giving you this colleague's background so that then we begin to shoot Kabile's Berlin, so that then we begin to have an implementable, all right, position on this topic. Peter Mukwena left, and then we employed Uluvuyo Dondolo, who's now Dr. Dondolo, who also tried his best, but he wrote some policy documents, but again, he was frustrated and he left. And then the last person that we employed in SAHRA then as the Living Heritage Officer was Mr. Thabo Manetsi, who's Dr. Thabo Manetsi now, who then was very, very instrumental in writing the policy framework on living heritage that we have. In fact, if you Google and you go back to the archives of SAHRA, you will find a policy document that Mr. Manetsi wrote and developed for SAHRA. But all those policy documents were never implemented. I think we failed, and I'm going to also blame myself here. We failed dismally, all right, to ensure that those policy documents are implemented and integrated in the manner in which we manage heritage resources. Fast forward, frustration from the nation at large on the failure by SAHRA to implement those policy documents led to initiative by other institutions. We know that at some stage, the Department of Arts and Culture then realizing that there is a failure to implement living heritage and integrate it to the broader conservation principles and methods. They then established a unit within the department which was going to deal with the living heritage. And I think Pakamani Mthembu was a person who was tasked with that opportunity. That again, he tried his best. I don't think we have succeeded in seeing to it that indeed Amasiko or living heritage, intangible heritage, is integrated in the manner in which we conserve heritage resources. That then was also followed by the National Monuments Council, Mr. Mpumlwane will attest to this one, who also then had a paper and I think a policy which is somewhere in the shelves of living heritage, because they too realize that we are missing opportunity, all right, to begin then to interpret heritage resources and heritage sites in a very inclusive and holistic manner. But Mr. Mpumlwane, I'm not sure that that policy managed to also be integrated into the mainstream conservation bodies. Now, what I'm saying, colleagues, is this is not a new topic. There has been this evolution, and there's been initiatives by various people to ensure that a very important part of the majority of the people in this country and the approach that they use in conserving their heritage resources is integrated in the manner in which we conserve our heritage resources. And it's an opportunity that I am glad that you're raising this topic again. And I'm hoping that the time of talking and debates and debate and conferences is ending. My proposal, Mamuma Chete and colleagues at SAHRA and colleagues at large, is to say there are so many policy documents, all right, in our institutions. And there are individuals who are having these policy documents. It is time for us to stop talking and say, we have this policy document, consolidate these policy documents, and have a policy document that is going to be implemented. I do not think that we need to do research or to start from scratch and write other policies. We have enough of these policies. All we need to do is to begin then to open our drawers. Even if these policies were developed by people that we do not like today, it is high time then we begin then to go back and say, what do we have? And how can we utilize some of these, all right, researched all right, policy documents and use them so that then we are able to say, indeed, we have incorporated amasiko, intangible heritage, into the current practices. I think my appeal, colleagues, I'm appealing here not as an academic or a funding, but from the experience that I have over many years of where we develop policy documents. South Africa is very good in writing policy documents, and they all end up in the shelves. Or maybe, as Utabo Mbeki said yesterday, we need to look at how we do things. Now, if you want then to listen to that speech, it might give you an indication of where we're failing. Listen to Thabo Mbeki when he was talking about ESCOM, what makes ESCOM to fail. I think, Program Director, I must stop there and say thank you very much for inviting us, but also to say to the younger people who are joining the institution, there are policy documents. Do not waste time and write new policy documents. Utilize the ones that are already in place, adapt them, and integrate them into the manner in which we conserve heritage resources. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ntate. I could listen to you the whole day. Sorry about that. Please mute. And that is why what you said was very, very profound. And I think we should go back to the drawing board. And it's good that these policies are already there. It's a matter of the adoption and implementation. So, Ms. Machete, it was thrown to you that it must not just be talks. This is not a tick in the box. It must be conversations that lead to implementations. So thank you so much, and I think now at least we have some background and we know the importance of living heritage. And it's good that there were offices before that accommodated such. So it shows the importance of intangible heritage. So once again, Ntate, thank you for your time and thank you for joining us. So having said that, colleagues, we're going to our third speakers. We have Mr. Richard Thompson, who is our legal officer, together with Ms. Heidi Weldon, who is the grading and declarations officer within SAHRA. Over to you, colleagues.
Please give me a moment while I get the presentation sharing. Did it share?
Heidi, it did, and then it just went away.
Sorry. Is it sharing now?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Okay, Richard, you'll let me know when to move to the next slide.
Sure, I will do. Thank you so much, Kim, and other colleagues and the guest speakers. Thank you so much for your very enlightening discussions already. So my name is Richard Thompson. I'm a legal officer at SAHRA, and I'm just going to very quickly run through the current legal framework when it comes to living heritage. As Tate Sebai is very kindly and very helpfully indicated, there's a lot of kind of policy documents that were written but never really came to the fore and finalized. But I will just briefly discuss one of them, one of the draft documents, which is in our research around the legal framework, which I will discuss quickly. But thanks, Heidi. You can move to the next slide. Thanks. All right. So just in terms of the legal framework as it stands, the main one is the NARA, So I will just run through where living heritage is discussed and contained in the NARA, and then another brief discussion on the national policy on South African living heritage, which, as Tate Sibai indicated, is only a draft, so it's not a a legally binding policy. It was a policy drafted, I believe, by the Department of Arts and Culture, DAC, which it was still called back in 2009. And I'll just run through a couple of things that it discusses on living heritage. Thanks, Heidi. Next slide. All right. So in terms of the NARA, the parts of the NARA that discuss living heritage or intangible heritage, it's defined in the definition section. Living heritage means intangible aspects of inherited culture and may include cultural tradition, oral history, performance, ritual, popular memory, skills and techniques, indigenous knowledge systems, and the holistic approach to nature, society, and societal relationships. Thereafter, in the NARA, it's discussed in the general principles, which is section 3, where it mentions that the national estate may include places to which oral traditions are attached or associated with living heritage, as well as movable objects, which would include objects to which oral traditions are attached or which are associated with living heritage. Thanks, Heidi. Further in the general principles, at section 3.3, it mentions that a place or object is to be considered part of the national estate if it has cultural significance or other special value because of its importance to the community or pattern of South Africa's history, its importance in exhibiting particular aesthetic characteristics valued by a community or cultural group, or its strong special association with a particular community or cultural group for social, cultural, or spiritual reasons. So contained in the general principles, very sort of broad principles about including living heritage or intangible heritage in our national estate. Thanks, Heidi. Further in the NARA, it talks about the functions, powers, and duties of SAHRA itself, and it just very broadly says that SAHRA must promote the systemic identification and recording of the national estate by amongst other things, promoting the identification and recording of aspects of living heritage associated with heritage resources. So there we see that SAHRA is itself given the mandate in the NARA to promote and identify and record living heritage, but again, without giving too much detail or guidance in that regard. And then the only other place that is mentioned in the Act refers specifically to heritage objects, where it mentions that an object or collection of objects may be declared a heritage object, and this would include objects to which oral traditions are attached and which are associated with living heritage. Thanks, Heidi. Okay, then just very basically, again, thanks to Tate Sibai for indicating that this policy is not was never approved and was sort of shelved, as he put it. But just in looking at the draft national policy on South African living heritage, it defines what safeguarding of living heritage would mean. It would mean measures aimed at securing the viability of the intangible cultural heritage, including the identification, documentation, research, preservation, protection, promotion, enhancement, transmission, particularly through formal and non-formal education, as well as the revitalization of the various aspects of such heritage, as is discussed in the UNESCO Convention. Thanks, Heidi. Another part of this policy, which is a potential challenge for the protection of living heritage, is it talks about the potential misinterpretation of safeguarding as meaning stagnation. So it discusses the challenge of ensuring that safeguarding heritage is not interpreted as making heritage rigid or preventing socio-cultural change. The protection, promotion, and transmission of heritage must be done in ways that enable communities to practice and promote their heritage in a changing environment, not as opposed to rigid principles. Because by its very nature, living heritage is living, and it is adapting with time. So the protection, promotion, and transmission must be a means of legitimizing diversity and continuity of heritage, rather than of promoting modernity, stagnation, or a singular way of performing social practices. There is a need to balance the safeguarding on the one hand with the dynamism of heritage on the other hand. Therefore, policy on living heritage at various levels of government must involve non-prevention of social change clauses. Thanks, Heidi. So going further on this point, the NARA does state that heritage resources must be carefully managed to ensure their survival because they are valuable, finite, non-renewable, and irreplaceable. So living heritage is indeed valuable and irreplaceable in the sense that it is rooted in the history and identity of a group or community. But one of the specific strengths of living heritage is that it is constantly being reproduced, developed, and renewed by that group or community who are bearers of the living heritage. Safeguarding living heritage, therefore, does not mean preventing change or freezing it, but encouraging continued practice and identification with it by bearer communities or groups. It also means safeguarding the conditions under which the living heritage is practiced, for example, by ensuring sustainable supplies of natural resources required for its practice, or negotiating continued access to sites that are commonly used for festivals. Thanks, Heidi. So just based on that, I think, as has been mentioned, the legislation and as it stands, is the policy, as has been mentioned, the policies have not been finalized, which is something that I think, again, has been indicated throughout this presentation is something that we need. And as was mentioned again by Tate Sebai, is we aren't at ground zero. We have lots of different drafts of policies which we can work towards having one policy. So we're not at the beginning. But in terms of the challenges to the protection of living heritage, is obviously the NARA. It's a challenge in terms of the intangibility of weighing up of rights, tangible versus intangible. Like on a very sort of broad example would be, if there's a development application, for example, and SAHRA needs to weigh up the rights of heritage versus the rights of, say, a developer. It's much easier when there's tangible rights. You can't develop over graves or an archaeological site, etc. Whereas it's slightly harder when you can't see the rights, as intangible heritage is, which is a challenge, and which is why these guidelines and the framework needs to be developed. And then the challenge being, as was mentioned in that policy, the safeguarding of intangible heritage without freezing in a changing environment. Understanding that the environment changes and society changes, so safeguarding this heritage without it being frozen in time, because that intangible heritage itself has grown. So finding a way to protect living and intangible heritage in a changing environment would be another challenge. So thank you. That's all from me, just in terms of, very briefly, as it stands, the legal framework in terms of living or intangible heritage. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just looking for my mic button so I could unmute. Thank you, Richard, and I would like to say thank you to our previous guest speakers. I think what's being highlighted, one, is that there is a fantastic opportunity, and there's a great value in including intangible cultural heritage or living heritage into the management of our heritage resources, and that previously many opportunities have been missed. But at the same time, that it was never really taken up in the way that it should necessarily have taken up. And I hear Mr. Sabai's appeal to us and the call for us to start heeding this opportunity and harnessing it. And so we hope to really heed your advice and to move forward with this. And hopefully this presentation in a very unintended way, I must be honest, has possibly leading us towards some sort of resolution or solution to the issue that we have at hand. So I'd like to say good morning to everybody. I'm Heidi Weldon. I am the Grading and Declarations Officer in the Heritage Protection Unit in SAHRA. And basically, majority, as most of you probably know already, my work deals with the identification and assessment of places and objects that could be of national significance. So a lot of my work is revolved around significance. For those of you, so first of all, I'd like to thank you all for being here today as well, and also to extend my gratitude to those that had attended the Thematic Framework initial consultation session in June, for attending today as well, and for your contributions that you have given so far. So just as a brief background and quick understanding, SAHRA is in the process of developing a national framework, a thematic framework, as a tool to assist in further identifying significances and heritage resources. It is not only the obvious significance that we are looking for, but we are looking for the hidden and buried significances that these resources may have, and to ensure a greater connectivity between the resources and the stories that they tell of our past. And it is hoped that this will then offer a more inclusive heritage landscape. And in order to be inclusive, when we develop this document, we've chosen to do this through rather extensive consultation sessions. So it's a framework that is going to be developed through various consultations, and we had our first one at the end of June and on the 26th of June this year. And so I will give some feedback and to show how greatly the contributions that we've received just from the one consultation session has changed the framework dramatically, and hopefully has offered a solution to being able to integrate intangible or living heritage more into the resources that we manage. Okay. So I'm just going to very quickly give a brief background for those that were not part of the consultation session and are sort of new to this idea of the thematic framework. I'm just going to go very, very briefly. I'm not going to go into too much detail. But as we know, that the NARA governs the protection and management of our heritage resources, and this is done through an integrated and interactive system of management of the national estate. And now the national estate, as we know, is comprised of resources that are determined to have cultural heritage value or significance. In addition to this, the NARA manages the heritage resources of South Africa within the 3 tiers of government, and this grading system determines where resources is managed and protected based on its significance. So therefore, what we manage, where we protect this, is all based on the values and significance identified within the resource. So with this, in 2003, SAHRA established a grading system as it was mandated to do under Section 7 by publishing the grading regulations. These regulations, however, did not further define what criteria are to be used in the assessment of cultural heritage significance. It more simply elaborated only on the notion of the sphere of influence. Following the regulations in 2004, a draft guide to grading was drafted by SAHRA, which sought to give further definition and criteria about how to think about significance. In this guide, a thematic chart was proposed to assist in the determination and assessment of the heritage significance. Following this, in 2005 and 2006, categories of themes were proposed and listed together to be used together with the thematic chart. However, it was unclear whether there was any public input into these themes, or whether they were approved or gazetted, or even used widely. Again, then in 2017 and again in 2019, we revised the operational guidelines for the Declaration of National Heritage Resources, which then also refer to the use of a thematic framework for identifying and assessing significance. So very quickly, the basic idea of a thematic framework is that it's a conceptual tool to be used in the determination and assessment of identified It's a conceptual tool for us to use in the determination and assessment of significance within the identified heritage resource by outlining themes and concepts to think more about the stories and activities around a resource rather than simply just the type or function of the resource. So it looks more sort of at the human activities around a site or actions. It must be a live document. I think Richard has alluded to it in terms of it, just in the name, living heritage. It is a living. It is living. It is dynamic. It changes, and so must this thematic framework. Significance, in its nature, is subjective, and it changes, and it is dynamic, and it moves. And therefore, our ability to assess and determine these significances must also be as dynamic and adaptable, and so must the tool that we use. Just to very quickly go over some of the benefits that come with the use of a thematic framework. It is really about identifying the gaps. It looks at the connections between the different resources, connections of the different histories. It looks towards attempting to balance an approach to the history that we represent. And it can also capture the diversity and complexity of our heritage resources by looking for those deeper meanings that aren't always as obvious. And then obviously from this, the more practical senses are that we can structure our research and our projects around these. And it also assists in the interpretation or possible reinterpretation. There was a mention previously in one of the other presentations that we need to look at re-examining the narrative that we tell of our heritage resources. And a thematic framework can aid towards that. So as I've mentioned at the beginning of the workshop, at the beginning of my presentation, SAHRA held an initial consultation session at the end of June. We held this online, and as Eskom is doing now to us, they played their part in instituting or implementing stage 6 load shedding on the day that we held our consultation session. So our representation at the workshop wasn't possibly as great as we had hoped, but we still managed to get really, really valuable input. And we had extensive and very constructive and valuable discussions around the themes. This was not meant to be an extensive public consultation. We're not at that stage yet. This will come later once we have a far more refined thematic framework. Then what we'll do from here is we wanted a more targeted session that would aimed at the authorities that would like us be using the framework in assessing significance in the management of heritage resources, so such as your PRAs and your local heritage authorities. These were municipalities where we had identified that they have established heritage divisions. We also looked at targeted government entities that we have worked closely with in the declaration of protection or formal protection of heritage resources. And then we also looked to identify professional bodies and other interested groups. Here we looked at traditional healers, the Khoi and the San groups, other universities, various museums, etc. And then we looked at, we invited a couple of identified experts around heritage management. And then we also had invited various experts in the specific themes that we had identified to help facilitate in the breakaway sessions. So what we presented and the initial draft framework that we presented to them was very much a table format. So we had identified 7 main themes, hopefully trying to encapsulate the broad history of South Africa. And as you can see, living heritage was then one of those themes that we had identified. These themes then formed the breakaway session. So we broke up into breakaway groups to discuss these themes specifically. Then each theme had a number of sub-themes attached to it, and this could vary according to the theme and what had been identified. But as you can see, it presents as a very linear, sort of boxy way of looking at heritage. And yeah, it doesn't seem to show much flow within the themes. So we received, as I mentioned, from these breakaway groups, extensive feedback and comments. And we're still working through all of these comments, but this is just a summary of some of the main themes or the main concerns and issues that are coming through from all of those comments we've gathered so far. There was a lot of discussion around how we think about heritage and history, and the constructs that these have, which influence how we assess significance and think about the past. There was a call for the reconsideration of these constructs of history and heritage to decolonize how we think about history and what history means. Well, the construct of history and the construct of heritage needs to be decolonized, and to include a more African perspective around these constructs. Then associated to this was the inclusion of minority history and heritage. And this is not as a specific theme or a sub-theme, but something that needs to run through all the themes as we go along. Again, the linear approach was mentioned, and this led to thinking of our heritage in a linear construct, but also to think of it sort of more chronologically, which leads to gaps in time periods having been represented. And there was a bit of concern and issues around that. And that this way of thinking about the themes then led to the loss of nuances of the past and how we think about the deep past. Which then also in turn limits the connectedness and the inclusion of memory into our themes and our assessments. Again, language was also something that was raised. The general feeling was that the language used in the framework could be quite divisive or specific, and that then this led to concerns about overlaps. And again, like I mentioned, there didn't seem to be a flow amongst the themes, so that was raised. And then also what was noted was that we had focused the themes looking very internally into South Africa. So looking at what was happening within our sort of loosely thought of ideas of the boundaries of South Africa, and not really thinking about how South Africa interacted in the world and looking beyond our boundaries a bit more, and not just sort of physically, but more sort of abstractively as well. So that was something that needed to be included. So based on these comments, I just want to go back to a few things that Richard has shared with us. And that part of our mandate as SAHRA is to promote the identification and recording of a living heritage associated to heritage resource. So this and it's the same with objects, but this makes us consider we need to have something very tangible in order to consider the intangible. And so the focus is more on the tangible aspect and then looking for the intangible. But when you consider the definition of what living heritage is, it's very much as it says, it is the intangible aspects of it. So it's not always possible to pin it specifically in a tangible aspect. And so by addressing the lack of living heritage represented in the resources that we do manage, by limiting this to an attempt to simply identify resources to which living heritage is associated, we are missing the nuances, and we are missing the integration and connectivity we need to be wholly inclusive. And so to ensure that we are capturing these unheard stories in our resources, and we need to develop a truly functional thematic framework. And so in order to do that, we've proposed and working towards a complete overhaul and revision of the thematic framework. So we're moving away from the notion of this linear approach or this linear representation of the themes or presentation of the themes, and to look at it in a sort of more circular format. This way, there's no specific chronology, there's no hierarchy, and the overlaps and the connections become a lot more visible in the framework. All the circles can be interrelated and interconnected. And if I had the skill of the presentation skills or the technology to do it, I would almost have those circles all sort of moving around and interacting with each other, because that's sort of the idea of how these themes need to work. And then following from that, is that we can then show how we can have sub-themes added to the themes, again, also in a sort of more circular way, and that they can all interact together. And it is very likely that there are going to be repetitions of some sub-themes in the broader themes that are presented. But like I say, this is working towards a revision. We're nowhere near complete yet, and yeah, hopefully we will get there. And by the time we go to public, by the broader public commenting, we will have something that a lot bigger and a lot more refined. So in addition to these sort of main themes and the circular notion, I was reading a paper that the US Parks had done when they revised their thematic framework. And they had also used a circular notion of representing the themes. But they included what they call the 3 historical building blocks to run through all the themes. I'd like to rather think of them as sort of the 3 cross-cutting connections through all the themes. And these are time, place, and people. Time was one that I thought was I found the most interesting, because it not only talks of time periods or chronology, but it talks about the change over time and the processes over time that took place. And this then leads us to thinking about how and why certain decisions were taken, and why and how certain the thinking behind the actions that took place there. But it also can obviously also include the time periods. Then we look at people, and obviously people are the main agents of change, but it goes a bit broader than that, and it looks at the more varied experiences that were had around a resource or an event, and this aims to recognize the variety that there is. So the differences in the experiences and the perceptions, and ultimately the interaction of the different races and ethnicities and gender and class of people that would have interacted with that resource or the event. And this helps us to comprehend a fuller range of human experience and the varied histories we have in our land, in our heritage landscape. Then in terms of place, and this is not just simply about the place in which a resource is situated, it's not just about the place in where the significance lies, is it at a national, provincial, or local level, but this is more about how what happened nationally impacted and influenced what was happening regionally and locally, and vice versa. So things that were happening on a localized, a local event could have sparked a national decision to be taken. So it just gives us, thinking of these across all the themes, just helps us to think of it in a more richer, more it prompts us to look for those deeper meanings, which is not tangible. It is not the obvious, and it is very much about the meaning and the experiences that people have of that today. So while we still have a separate theme of living heritage in our thematic framework, there is a call for these intangible aspects such as memory and the cosmologies and worldviews and knowledge systems to be very much a part of it, cutting across through all the different themes that we have. And it is hoped that through this sort of more circular representation, but also through the inclusion of these cross-cutting connections, that we can draw out these greater nuances. We can identify more varied experiences and a deeper appreciation for the intangible or living heritage, rather than just simply, the obvious that we see. This should also allow for a balance in what is in what is protected, but it also allows for the change and that dynamic aspect to be safeguarded, as Richard mentioned. So it's not freezing our perception of a heritage resource, but it is allowing for these social changes to take place by including these deeper understandings of living heritage. So, and we also hope that through the thematic framework in the trajectory that it's taking now, is that it will encourage heritage practitioners to start searching for these deeper underpinnings in the resources that we have identified so far. So, just as a brief in closing, in our way forward now, and in the spirit of ensuring extensive consultations, we will be moving towards our more focused grouped consultations. So we will be taking there's still more work to be done on the thematic framework as it is now, but to be taking that to the various groups and to discuss it in depth to ensure that we recapitulate and capture what they are looking for in how we assess our heritage resources. And then once we've done this, only then will we publicize the sort of more refined thematic framework for public commenting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Weldon and Mr. Thompson, for your presentations. I think it was very, very informative, well detailed and thorough. Thank you once again, colleagues. And having said that, we've reached the end of our presentations. Thank you to all our speakers. And I see our chat boxes are very interactive. So now I'll be opening us up to the open discussions where I'll be taking questions. And just to note that Mr. Zibai has left as he had some other prior commitments. But we have Mr. Kwezi, Ms. Machete, we have Heidi, and we have Mr. Thompson. So I'll be opening up for questions or comments. Thank you, colleagues. Mr. Douglas, you can come in.
Yeah, good day, Chairperson. It is Kuba Walifan Kurana, the National Chairperson of the Kai Kurana Transfrontier. First of all, thank you very much for well-balanced discussion. However, from where we are sitting as Khoe San, we are very concerned about the the reality that SAHRA is in actual fact reinventing itself, because you have to choose your words carefully as officials. But we have very grave concerns about the flood of nominations that will be coming from the Khoi and San traditional sector, and the capacity issues associated with SAHRA in managing these approaches. I will be making one or two examples with you, permission, Chair. One of our constituents is Klipjewel. It's just on the border with Swartland and Cape Winelands. The first radio station was actually used by the Royal Air Force just after 1930. Telkom took the facility over the land over in 1960, just after 9. And the first monologue radio signals for the Western Cape was erected on that land. It was the first Telkom radio signal carriers for the whole province that connects the country. But the significance of it is that that land is a Kurana kraal. And the same as like with the Liesbeek, the same as with the Navy's communication facility at Silvermine, those places, those geographic places, had a particular spiritual meaning to our people. It's where our concept, our practice of astrology was a spiritual center. Technically, those people were places of worship, because our people were able to navigate the cattle route, our trading routes, by navigating the stars. So those geographic places had particular meaning. But today we see, when you deal with the SAHRA application form, again, this is questions that we raised prior with the CEO. I also mentioned this to Heidi Weldon, that from a Khoi and San perspective, we have a number of concerns in terms of structural methodology when we are applying. Because in the case of Kurana, for example, it is not exclusive. Kurana is not an exclusive Khoi group. Kurana is intermarried to Inguni, Abatembo, Pondo Fingal, a bit of Zulu. So it's a very intermarried group of the Khoi. In there is also a Malay flavor, even a white Afrikaner flavor. So the concept of our estate speaks to many other cultural dimensions of other groups. But the whole process that is supposed to make it easy to record and have that estate validated in terms of the SAHRA processes is very difficult, because it's a sequence of events. It's never a single event. It's a collective of historic persons, never one. It's a spread of spaces and places. It's never exclusively one place, because our people were moved exactly 19 times by force since the last Border Control Act was implemented by Sir Walter Currie, the last colonial governor or military commander of the British. With that respect, is you'll find our previous two generations were not buried in the place where they were born. The children were not born in the place where the previous generation was buried. So there is a lot of fragmentation in terms of memory, custom, and culture on the side of Khoi, which the forms does not make easy to explain. It's fine to say, yes, just do it on a separate annexure. But the entire SAHRA process in management, from forms to officials, does not understand the Khoi and San narrative. Now, take us, for example. One of our chieftaincies, the chieftaincy of that very place, Klipjewel, the Rose chieftaincy of the Kuranas, they suffered losses in the colonial period, but suffered losses at the hands of the apartheid police also. One of their brothers was brutally murdered by the apartheid police, but the memorialization of these people, some of them were forgotten completely in memory. And what our concern is we are under a validation process of the Khoi and San Commission at the moment, as we submitted for recognition under the Khoi and San Commission. However, what we foresee, unfortunately, when that recognition process is on its course, and the minister and the president has coordinated these Khoi and San traditional leaders, you will have a barrage of court cases following that, because the processes cannot usher in effectively the Khoi and San heritage estate in its diversity, because I cannot speak for other Khoi and San, I can only speak for Kurana. But in that essence, we have made it clear to SAHRA the only way for our people to speak their narrative from their own collective memory, because to us, our memory cannot be separated from Nguni. Here in Cape Town, you have Maitland. There, the Amaslupi was kept by the British. Then Ndabeni, here in Cape Town. The Abatembo in Luandla. It's the oldest migrant labor museum in South Africa, but it's related specifically to our crowds. But you have a segregated approach in terms of how these matters are approached. We don't see a lot of clarity how, for example, our different portions of a state can be protected by a Section 25B heritage governing body, because our Western Cape provincial government simply don't understand the concept of Khoi and San culture, or culture for that matter. I don't know, it's because of the political administration or for whatever reason, but it poses real problems to us. Here in the Western Cape, you have the most, people speak about decolonization. Just an example, Ezekiel museums, when you walk in there, it's technically a colonial room that you walk into. So our concern is SAHRA in arts and culture speaks of decolonization, but its very own agencies has not even been decolonized. Those are the type of real concerns our people have. So we push the proposal at the June webinar to say SAHRA needs to make a place where our communities can curate their own estate. SAHRA needs to make provision for the community curatorship, where our people, the oldest ones, can still curate their history from their perspective, where they still live, where they used to live. We need the ability to explain our estate, because it belongs in the national estate. We cannot speak of national unity, social cohesion, if the Khoi narrative is not understood. Because today, when we speak to people who are not from our community, people who do not understand our customs, culture, and tradition. And it's a technical sounding board in the room that says, okay, Kokta is doing the recognition of Khoi and San leaders. That's beautiful. That is beautiful. But when those recognitions are done, those traditional authorities recognized will have no choice but to resort to the courts to get their people's estate recognized and protected. It's not just about the graves, it's not just about events. Here in the Western Cape, our Nguni family, for example, their memory has simply been erased. People perceive Nguni people as people who came into the Western Cape as visitors, I don't know what. But they have been a fundamental part of our family life before 1913, in our crowds, as Khoi and San, as Kurana in particular. So uh, there's a number of, and the only person, for example, when we talk SAHRA, there's only one person that provides us with assistance. It's Heidi Weldon. Now, imagine if we have to burden one person in SAHRA. We have to burden one person in SAHRA with all our questions. It's not a practical or fair situation to Heidi Weldon, for example. Robben Island, my great ancestor, Klaas Lucas, escaped twice from Robben Island. Twice. The story about Robben Island today, Robben Island has been turned into a tourism facility, and the actual extent of the collective history associated with the Robben Island. It's not just the liberation struggle. It's not just the place where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned. It's not just the place where ANC leaders were exiled. There is a profound history long before the formation of our ANC, for example, associated with Robben Island, that features nowhere. It only lives in our people's memory. Today in the Western Cape, we find ourselves under clouds of colonial shadows that perpetuates racial profiling. It perpetuates division. It perpetuates prejudice. It perpetuates everything our constitution and our policies of state is trying to eradicate. So I'm asking Kwesi, for example, to please, I'm going to put my number on this group. My number is 060-335-3506. Please send me a WhatsApp call. We want to have a discussion on Robben Island. We want to have a discussion on the community curatorship. We want SAHRA to adopt the community curators as a program, as a pilot program for absorbing and testing and analyzing collective oral history and collective memory from a Khoi and San perspective. I have nothing more to say. The only thing I would like to say is extend my gratitude to Heidi Weldon. I don't know where we would go if it wasn't for Heidi Weldon. But again, it cannot just be Heidi Weldon that supports barrage of questions such as ours. So I'm appealing to people such as Kwesi. Please allow us to contact you so that we can have a Robben Island discussion from our Khoi and San perspective. So thank you. I hope my voice will be heard, and I hope I can get a response from Kwesi and from the CEO on the question of community curatorship from a Khoi and San perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wesley. We understand your frustrations, and indeed, these are the platforms to raise such matters. That's why as SAHRA, we try as much to have community engagement, public participations. We have these webinars and seminars because we can't always be in one sitting. So thank you for that comments, and I'm sure they are noted. And yeah, we'll note that, and you can communicate with Mr. Kwesi in another offline meeting, if I can put it that way. Thank you so much. Any other questions, comments? Mr. Wesley, your hand is still up. Is that a legacy hand?
I'd just like to know if Mr. Kwesi have received my contact number to message me so that we can hopefully have a conversation.
Tate Kwesi, you can respond. Oh, okay. I think maybe he's caught up, but we can send you his email address if you need to contact him. Colleagues, any further questions? I see comments in the chat box. All right, colleagues, if there are no other further questions or comments, we are going to close our session, and we'll have Mr. Ben Mwasinga closing for us. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you so much, Kim. I'll be closing on behalf of Ms. Mama Kamoreng Khasi Lisoona, who is the Executive Officer for Heritage Resources Management at SAHRA. Unfortunately, she's not available today. She has another engagement with the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture. First and foremost, just as an observer and a listener in today's discussions, I am very, very much excited and very, very, I'd say, stimulated by the conversations that have taken place here today. When we talk about intangible cultural heritage, I think that this Heritage Protection Unit correctly phrased the theme for today's discussion around the missing link in heritage management. We had the previous speaker, Kubaha. I think we've been incorrectly referring to him as Wesley, but that is the name on the screen. So I see Heidi has put the name as Kubaha. And he raised a number of issues which I think speak directly to why this presentation is here today. On the one hand, we have an official narrative which has existed through multiple periods in South Africa's history. There is a pre-colonial history, there is a colonial history, and there's a history of apartheid if we look at the major eras in terms of modern South African development. And through these periods, there have been celebrations of certain groups at the expense of others. there has been the memorialization of certain groups at the expense of others. And what we can say is that we as SAHRA fully acknowledge that the system that we are operating under does not capture the multiple histories that exist within this country accurately. There were multiple comments throughout the chat that speak to this. One of our colleagues, Ruan, mentioned that we need to follow a decolonized approach when identifying some of these resources. We have Ms. Pratini, who further emphasized within the chat as well that it is problematic to refer to an official history, but somehow we need to consolidate these multiple histories. And so the HPU unit has began taking those steps, which is why in the June conversation, in the June Thematic Framework Workshop, Heidi Weldon and Nkosazana Machete and Kim Ngobeni invited multiple stakeholders that have begun to unpack their own histories. The idea, or I'd say the challenge with the approach that was followed before, was that it was a top-down approach. You have a legislation, and if you cannot operate within the parameters of that legislation, you may find that your history is lost. And this is exactly the challenge that Kubaha was referring to in his previous chat. I wish he actually had a presentation of his own, because as Regina Isaacs has stated, he has brought up very pertinent issues in terms of the interconnectedness of all of our histories. And so I hope that this is not the end of this discussion. It is just the very beginning, because yes, we are a constitutional democracy. Therefore, we need to develop legal frameworks in order to recognize these histories. But we can also be cognizant of the fact that SAHRA does not exist to tell people what their histories are, but SAHRA exists as a facilitator so that communities can tell their own stories. And I think that is what I'd like to emphasize here today. I'd like to thank Ntate Kwezi Mpulwana, who is a friend of SAHRA and from the National Heritage Council, for always engaging and being willing to attend these various platforms to present the position from the NHC, but also his position as an academic and as a historian. I think that what he spoke about in terms of, again, reconciling this framework to a community-based approach is spot on. I want to thank, in his absence, Ntate Dumisani Sibai. There are no words I can use to describe his contribution to heritage resource management in South Africa. And furthermore, he has reminded us that there is work that has already been done previously, and we should not lose track of that. And then I'd like to thank Ms. Heidi Weldon and Mr. Richard Thompson for providing us with what I would say is the first look in a number of years of what the legislative framework is, and also how to remedy those blind spots within the legislative framework. Richard Thompson, again, basically emphasized that we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater when we are focusing on this decolonization or on these alternative approaches. We should also be cognizant of the fact that there is existing legislation, but it must be beefed up and also implemented, most importantly. And again, Heidi Weldon, who has been thanked by Kubaha for her presentation, also detailing the thematic framework and the areas which we want to explore. And again, this is not to say that it is a limited approach or that this ends the conversation. It is just the beginning, and we do want to capture the multiple histories, especially for those groups that were previously ignored. And then I want to thank the manager of the Heritage Protection Unit, Ms. Nkosazana Machete, for providing this platform to her colleagues today and for her introduction. And last but not least, I also want to thank the program director, Kim Ngobeni, who has done an amazing job today as program director for this session. I know that these are very sensitive issues, and I think you've handled them very well. So with that said, I want to thank all of you for being present today. The chat, again, has been on fire. We will continue to look at those comments. We will be taking these comments into consideration. We have recorded this session, and we will make it available to everyone on YouTube as well. With that said, I want to thank you all for attending today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben, for that vote of thanks. Thank you, colleagues, for availing yourselves. Thank you to all our external visitors. We hope that this was very informative. And as Ben said, this is just the beginning, and there are talks that will still come. And this is our heritage webinar where we celebrate Heritage Month. And for us, it's a very special month to us because this is where we get to host such seminars and engage with the communities at large. So having said that, thank you so much, colleagues. We have officially closed our session. Thank you.